Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. Today we're going to be rounding out my thoughts on the second part of the For Your Eyes Only short story compilation, which includes some of the most oddball 007 stories I've come across so far, starting with Quantum of Solace. Okay, so for this one, I'm departing from my usual structure of talking about, plot, Bond, supporting characters and all that, because this one is so different from every other Bond story I've come across so far that I just kind of need to talk about it as a whole. So Bond is in the Bahamas, he's attending a dinner at the governor's house, and Bond is really bored and is being deliberately provocative in an attempt to spice up some of the evening's conversation. Everyone has left, and it's just Bond and the governor, and then the governor proceeds to tell Bond a story about a mild-mannered, kind civil servant named Philip Masters, who married an air hostess named Rhoda Llewellyn, and how that relationship went really well to begin with, and then kind of broke down as time went on. I'm kind of cutting a long story short here by paraphrasing, but the governor's whole point of this story is that in a relationship, if one party is so inhumane and treats the other party so terribly, then that means that their quantum of solace is at zero, and the relationship is unsalvageable and over. It's all very interesting, except that the story itself is actually quite mundane, and the breakdown that the whole anecdote builds up to is kinda anticlimactic. Like, the governor is really building this story up, and Bond is getting more and more engrossed, and in the end, it's basically that the wife, Rhoda, has an open affair with another guy in the town and behaves really horribly to Philip, and so the guy has a bit of a breakdown and divides the house into two, and while the man and his wife keep up appearances in public as a couple, they don't speak or do anything really in private. The story climaxes with the governor revealing that Philip Masters, the husband, eventually went back to the UK, and he leaves Rhoda with a load of unpaid debts, and she's really humbled by the whole experience. And that's sort of it. Like, she can't pay off the loan that they got for the television set, and it's very embarrassing, and she has to give it back. I guess I just expected something a bit more dramatic, like, murder or suicide, or something more than just like, oh, isn't it going to be terribly embarrassing when the people down the road see the man come to take back the TV set that we couldn't pay for? And of course that is, totally deliberate. I mean, it's clearly trying to be somewhat domestic and relatable. I just think you could do this in 5 pages. I do not need the entire life story of these people in this anecdote. A friend of mine once told me of a game that you can play if, like Bond in this story, you are stuck at a boring dinner party and want to antagonize someone. Okay, let's say you're stuck with someone really dull at a party or event, and they're telling you this really, long-winded anecdote, and it goes on for, 15 minutes, and you're having this whole epic story, and it all comes down to, one line. You can really annoy the person telling the story by just basically summing up their story in one line and just be like, so they took the TV set away. And I was kind of expecting Bond to do something similar to that here, but no, he's actually really taking in the story, and he leaves the evening feel like he's learned something, because it turned out that one of the people at the party who he thought was really dull and boring was Rhoda, with a new husband. So don't judge a book by its cover is, I guess, the lesson that Bond is taking away from this experience, which just seems a little bit preschool to me, but okay. Fleming himself apparently heard the anecdote from a friend and appropriated it here and featured Bond, but beyond James Bond being in the story, there's really nothing Bondian here at all. I just kind of get the sense that Fleming was really taken in by the anecdote when he heard it, and especially particularly the phrase quantum of solace, but the use of it and how it applies to the story is very clunky, I think. There's a lot of explanation needed for that phrase to make sense, and as such it just ends up feeling kind of inelegant. It's a really nice title, it's a nice collection of words. I just find the meaning too specific and yet vague at the same time. I think this is highlighted even further when you hear people like Daniel Craig try to justify the title's usage for the 2008 movie. I think it relates to the fact that if you don't have that quantum of solace in a relationship, you should give up. If you are not respecting each other, it's over. And at the end of the last Bond movie, Bond doesn't have that because his girlfriend has been killed. Which isn't really the same as what's explained in the book because it's a completely different situation. I suppose the title bothers me a lot because it just sounds really cool, Quantum of Solace, but the meaning behind it is just a load of words and attempts at something more profound, which basically comes down to guy met girl, girl cheated on guy, guy left girl, and she couldn't pay off the TV set. Suffice it to say, not one of my favourite Bond stories at all. But normal service is resumed with the next short story in the collection, Risico. So the story begins with Bond at a dinner with a CIA informant called Christatos, who is helping our hero investigate a drug smuggling operation, and it turns out that the man that Christatos is willing to finger for the whole shebang is at the restaurant too, one Enrico Colombo. Bond ends up spending some time with Colombo's mistress, Liesel, and there's a really good sequence of action on a beach before Bond is captured and taken to Colombo himself, who reveals that Christatos is actually the one in charge of the drug smuggling operation and is being financed by Russians. Bond is convinced that this is the truth and pairs up with Colombo to storm Christatos's drug warehouse and eventually eliminates Christatos himself. As a reward, I guess, for this, Colombo allows Bond to shag Liesel. Because he has plenty of mistresses and she gets no say in the matter. And that's it. Pretty simple plot, and much like From a View to a Kill and For Your Eyes Only, it's very easy to see how this story could become an episode of a TV show. It moves along very briskly, there are a couple of really nice action sequences, and Bond gets with a girl at the end, all very nice and tidy. Bond is very much himself in this story. I don't know if we find out anything terribly new about him. I do find it interesting that he is ultimately duped and doesn't discover this himself, but rather has to be told by someone else. Like, you know, he thinks that Christatos is genuinely a friend until Colombo tells him otherwise, and he just kind of believes Colombo. I guess it makes him seem a little weak, or not entirely on his game at least, but regardless of that, he certainly doesn't seem like a massive fan of Christatos, and Fleming certainly writes the character as he would a villain, even before we find out that he is actually a villain. So I don't know, the dialogue he and Bond have together felt kind of off to me reading it. You know something's up. Or perhaps it's just because I've seen the movie and I know that Christatos is ultimately the villain. And Christatos is a suitably unpleasant figure, and Colombo reminded me greatly of Kerim Bey from Russia with Love. He's this big, passionate personality, and while he's a friend of Bond's, certainly there's some morally questionable aspects about him and his business, particularly his treatment of Liesel in particular, but women on a whole. Colombo's whole racket certainly opens up some questions about morality. Especially when the subject of drug smuggling comes up and it's seen as like the worst of the worst, and it's like, you know, how dare you think that I, Colombo, would be involved in drug smuggling? It's such a dreadful business. But sex trafficking is fine, isn't it? Want a woman? I got plenty. It's just kind of fascinating to see what is deemed to be okay and not okay to these people. More than any other story in this compilation, Risico most resembles scenes from the movie For Your Eyes Only. The whole story is basically just a good middle chunk of the movie, with some tweaks, of course, like Liesel in the movie version is actually killed, in the story she lives, and it's Locke instead of Christatos that is killed at the end of the warehouse raid, but overall I was really surprised at how much of this was actually used. It was one of the few titles coming into this read-through that I actually had little to no knowledge of at all, so I had no idea what to expect from it, really. It's a real shame that the title Risico has yet to be used for an official Bond movie or game, as it's a pretty great title, but unlike the vague, waffling justification of using Quantum of Solace as a title, I can't imagine how they could put a spin on using Risico as a title, given that there's not really anything that they can adapt from the story that hasn't already been adapted and used in another Bond movie. Overall, I found Risico to be a perfectly pleasant story. I suppose I'm just kind of over-familiar with the setup and the twist, and that made it a bit less interesting because I know the movie so well. So it's not one of my favourites from this collection, but still a really nice story overall. And so with that we come to the last story in the collection, the Hildebrand Rarity, which also happens to be my very favourite story in this collection by quite a margin. This is one of the less conventional stories, but one that you can certainly imagine being an episode of a TV show nonetheless. So Bond is in the Seychelles on assignment, and he meets up with a mate there called Fidel Barbie, who introduces Bond to an American millionaire named Milton Crest, who then enlists the pair to help him locate and capture a rare fish known as the Hildebrand Rarity. Barbie is hired because he knows the Seychelles better than anyone, and Bond is hired because he's an incredibly strong diver. The trio, along with Milton's wife Elizabeth, sets sail, and it quickly becomes apparent that Milton Crest is the most dreadful man alive. He's rude, he's crass, he's an incredibly unpleasant man to be around, and if that isn't enough, he beats his wife with a whip made of a stingray's tail. Some of the dialogue between Bond and Crest I actually really adore, because it's just Bond trying so hard to contain his absolute displeasure at having to be in this guy's company. To say that Bond has mentioned a few times that he doesn't really like the business of killing very much, you really do get the sense that he would just love to put Milton Crest out of everyone's misery. Anyway, they find the spot where the fish supposedly lives, and I absolutely love this whole sequence. Bond and Barbie are diving in search of the Hildebrand Rarity, and there's all this wonderful description of the underwater life, and Bond kind of anthropomorphizes this scene in his mind, and he starts to refer to it as a city, and really appreciates and admires this underwater world, and it's so beautifully described. It's a fantastic few passages. But this beauty is scuppered, of course, by Milton Crest, who spots the Hildebrand and decides to pour poison on the whole area in order to capture it, and Bond is really willing the fish to escape. He's really invested in getting this fish away from Crest. He does not want Crest to destroy this beautiful world and claim his prize. But he does, and he gets it. Later that night, aboard Milton's boat, the Wave Crest is just drunk and abusive and gloating about his pathetic victory, and he's going to sell on the Hildebrand and make a fortune, and Bond and Elizabeth and Barbie all go to bed when Bond is alerted in the middle of the night, and he goes out to find that Crest is dead in his hammock. The Hildebrand itself has been stuffed down his throat, so he presumably died of suffocation. Bond expresses zero remorse, and quite rightly, but sets about covering up the kill so that he and the rest of the people on board won't be dragged into an investigation. He makes it look like Crest's hammock broke and then he fell into the sea, which I'm not quite sure how logistically that would work if Crest's hammock was hanging over the side of the boat or something. But then I love this bit, prior to finding out that Crest was dead, Bond is having real trouble sleeping, partly because Crest is snoring so loudly and that's disturbing him, but also just because he's just got so much rage and hatred in his body, he's just he can't sleep, he's really annoyed, and then as soon as he has found out that Crest is dead and he covers up the killing, he goes to bed and sleeps like a baby, and I just love that detail. And then the question is, who done it? Could it be the abused wife Elizabeth, or could it be Barbie, who was angered by Crest's drunken ranting on the previous night? Who stuffed the rare fish down the guy's throat and choked him? Well, we don't find out. We have Bond observing both Barbie and Elizabeth, and he's trying to figure out, who did it? He's not going to report anyone to the authorities. He doesn't want there to be an investigation. He's perfectly happy that Milton Crest is dead. But just out of curiosity, he's wondering who it is. And there's a couple of tip-offs, but they're both playing it so coolly that you can't pin it on either of them 100%. I think that there is a slight more implication that it could be Elizabeth, and that certainly makes more sense, but it's certainly open-ended, and that's where the story ends. It's a very strange plot, but I absolutely love it. In Quantum of Solace, I really don't think you need Bond there at all, but if you were to take Bond out of this story, despite it not being a conventional 007 adventure, I think the Hildebrand Rarity would lose at least half of its impact. Some of the passages where Bond is observing the undersea life and the fish and the lives of all these creatures, and they're just wonderful passages, and he's getting really attached to this society of fish, and he catches himself, he calls himself out on it. He talks about how to, kill a man and how that's employment, and he's so cool and disliking of it, and yet he sees this little society of fish and he's really invested in the sea life and in their survival. He really does not want them to be killed. But a big part of Bond's mentality at this point is fueled by the fact that Milton Crest is just about the most disgusting excuse of a man on Earth. He's so horrible that, as unpleasant as it is to see an entire population of fascinating marine life devastated, you just root for the fish to get away. You do not want this man to succeed in his goal. So obviously Milton Crest is the most memorable of the supporting characters, but Elizabeth and Barbe make up a good quartet, and there isn't really anyone else that matters in the story except for those three and Bond. Elizabeth is a desperately beaten down woman, beautiful and kind and young, but horribly treated. It's hard not to feel something for her given the situation she's in, and Barbie seems like a cool enough guy for Bond to hang around with. They certainly don't have the rapport that Bond has with Felix Leiter, but he's still a cool friend character to have along for the adventure. So, of course, there's no film in the official series that uses this title, but the name Hildebrand does appear in the movie Spectre, of course, as the cover name for an MI6 safe house. It is kinda a clunky title, but I do love it, and it's my favourite unused Fleming title, more than Risico or Property of a Lady. Outside of the name, there is the character Milton Crest, who is basically adapted straight into License to Kill, complete with drunken unpleasantness, and the stingray tail whip that he uses in the book to beat his wife Elizabeth is given to the original villain of License to Kill, Franz Sanchez, instead. Overall, I adored the Hildebrand Rarity, and I think it's one of the strongest Bond stories I've ever read. It's so coherent as a short story, Bond's involvement is completely necessary, and it doesn't just feel like a mini-mission or like an excerpt from a larger story. If you can only read one story from this collection, make it this one. And it's largely thanks to that particular short story that I'll be ranking this collection quite highly overall compared to the other Fleming works. The other stories, I think, in this collection, 3 of them I think are great. I think one of them, being Hildebrand, is phenomenal, and I think there's one that is not so great in Quantum of Solace that I would recommend people maybe skipping. There is one more short story compilation coming up in this read-through of mine. We'll be getting to Octopussy and the Living Daylights someday, but next time it'll be back to business as usual with Thunderball. So I'm really looking forward to revisiting a proper Bond novel after the slight detour of this short story collection. Thunderball especially, though, is a book with some really interesting history behind it, and it was the source of the adaptations of 2 of my very least favourite Bond movies, so I'm looking forward to reading that and seeing if the story on the page works any better than the story on the screen for me. But that's it for this time, Bond fans, and please, as always, leave your thoughts in the comments section below, and please do follow me on various social medias, including my Facebook page and my Twitter page, and you can also check me out on Patreon if you would like to support me on there. That's it for this time, Bond fans, so long for now.